Hi, Lenny.
What is it?
You looking good?
Uptown. Sure. And one of the things I want to talk about with this first one that the city adopts for the
Hi, everybody. Just, I think we can get started here. I know we want to break up the fun, but we'll see if we can start that. I'm John Quincy, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting today, May 5th, joined by council members Andrew Johnson, Linnea Palmisano, and Blong Yang, and we are a quorum, and we'll expect others to join us as we get going. I think I'll start off by moving the 16 items on the consent agenda, which include acceptance of a low bid from Canon Solutions America for a production color printer rental bid, acceptance of a Clear Channel Outdoor donation of digital billboard display time, and a Comcast cable donation of public service announcements. We're accepting the low bid for a restroom and locker room renovations bid from the Convention Center, authorizing a contract with Sierra Systems Group for Compass Financial Systems upgrade. From the three items from the Community Planning and Regulatory Services Committee were the receiving comments and approving the submittal of the 2014 Consolidated Plan, as well as the grant applications for the 2014 HOPWA grants, and receiving money from Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and the appropriation of NSP funds. From the Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee is the amendment to a contract with Hennepin County for the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Grant. And from Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management is the application for the Byrne Criminal Justice Innovation Program Grant, as well as approving a joint powers agreement with related to Major League Baseball All-Star Game. And from Transportation and Public Works Committee, we have 5 items, including a special assessment appeal settlement, amendment to the master funding agreement for the Southwest Minneapolis Interceptor Rehabilitation Project. I'm sure you've all been on your seats waiting for that. As well as the 4th Street ramp and the 35W on-ramp and auxiliary lane project, and the cancellation of a sidewalk reconstruction special assessment, and acceptance of low bids for construction and related materials contracts. And are there any questions from committee members on, or any comments on those 16 items? Seeing none, all in approval of those items, please say aye. Aye. And those items carry. Thank you very much. I think the discussion item is, of course, our continuing presentation series, and this particular one from the Finance Department by Ms. Christensen will be on property taxes, and I think you're joined by a special guest, our Assessor Patrick Todd, so we look forward to that.
Thank you, Chair Quincy and members of the committee. We are here today to provide you a little information about property taxes. We've had several sessions so far in which we've discussed city's debt obligations and ongoing funding mechanisms, and property taxes as one of the revenue sources that the city relies upon in order to fund its operations and annual budget. With that, I will start my presentation. So, what is property tax? We're going to talk about what property taxes are, what organizations or what jurisdictions levy property taxes, who pays property taxes, how is it calculated, and then I'll have a couple of slides just giving you a little bit of information regarding the history of property taxes in the city of Minneapolis. So what is property tax? Property tax is a tax that's assessed upon a parcel of real property, which is real estate, based upon its valuation. And for the purposes of taxation, it's really all real estate and immovable infrastructure. There are types of property that are not taxable, and if they're not real property, they're deemed personal property, and they are not subject to property taxes. There are really several different types of taxes that the cities and state rely upon to fund their business. You may have heard of the three-legged stool. It's a term that's been used much by the Department of Revenue. And you'll see that in the state of Minnesota, there's several different categories, but in large part, individual income taxes comprise about a third of the overall tax income in the state. Property taxes are approximately 1/3, and sales tax is a little bit less than that. But you can see there really are three major types of taxes assessed in the state of Minnesota. In this slide, you can see that over time and depending on various economic factors, the three types of taxes will vary. However, you'll notice that some of them actually move in contradictory directions. You'll see that in 2008, which is the middle, when income taxes were higher, property taxes were a little bit lower, but then in 2013, when income taxes were declining, property taxes were higher. So there's a bit of a disparity between economic indicators and the collection of the various types of taxes. So who levies property taxes? Any local political subdivision of the state of Minnesota, including cities, townships, counties, and schools. And there's also other organizations known as special districts, which are WMO is a water management organization. The Metropolitan Council also is able to assess taxes, regional rail authorities, as well as housing and redevelopment authorities. Who pays the property taxes? Property owners for various property classes. You're probably familiar with commercial, industrial, residential, apartments, as well as recreational and cabin-type properties. There are several others as well. Some units or some properties are not subject to property taxes. Generally speaking, property owned by other governmental units, nonprofit organizations, and for many of those organizations that do not pay property taxes, they may enter into an agreement with the local government to provide a payment in lieu of taxes. Because the city must continue to provide services to those properties as well, that agreement allows for the local government to collect some form of payment in exchange for providing those services. Each of those types of property that I mentioned has a different class rate, which basically determines the amount of the property's value that is subject to taxation. It's very complicated. It's determined by the state legislature, and is why one of the reasons why trying to calculate what your property taxes are can be very difficult, because there's more than 30 different property tax classes and rates. And I've included a link to the House research for you to review at your leisure, giving you a list of the different property tax rates. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Todd.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members, Patrick Todd, Minneapolis City Assessor. Thank you for having me here. I always enjoy talking about property taxes whenever possible. So just to add a little bit of a couple more comments to the budget directors. Everything is per statute. All real estate is taxable unless otherwise stated in the statute that it's not. So it's assumed that every parcel is paying taxes. The only way it gets off the tax rolls is it has to be identified at the legislative level to say, okay, we choose not to tax this or to provide a program that might defer taxes or provide some property tax relief. In addition to that, besides real estate, the statement that the budget director said personal property is not taxed, which is absolutely correct, but there is a couple of things that are interesting about that. We also do tax the income off personal property. So in cases of billboards, in cases of cell towers, those are income generating to a building. We actually value the income stream, and they do pay taxes on what a lot of people think it is personal property, because that is let's say a billboard can be removed, antennas can be removed, but the way we can look at it in the assessment is that is an income that a buyer would be willing to pay at the time of sale. They do take a look at that, and because of that, we do value that income stream on personal property. So other than that, on my slide that we have up here regarding the statewide effective tax, I'm using a slide that the Department of Revenue had produced a few years ago, and I do need to get it updated from them. But the peak back in 1995, 1996 on the property classification was one of the highest ever. You can see when we take a look at the red line at the top, that was the commercial industrial rate, and that was almost 6%. 6% of their value was being paid in property taxes. If you go down about a third of the way, there's a brown line. That was the apartment rate, and the apartment was at about a 4.25%. And then if you go all the way down, the second line from the bottom, it was a blue line, and that's what the residential homestead rate is, and that was at about a 1.5%. And so you can see from 1996, which was the peak, through the legislature, they have made a concerted effort to try to get these rates to be more competitive with neighboring states. There was the discussion at the time that they felt that if they could be more competitive, that you'd be able to retain a lot of the employment base that we have, a lot of the Fortune 500 companies. We could also attract smaller businesses that want to do startup if you were more competitive on the property tax base. So it is a fairly dramatic change. The reason why I'm talking about this is because the actual property tax policy that the Minneapolis adopts through its legislative agenda, as well as what the state has, is equally important as the rate itself. So the policy has to have a lot of good foresight into it, and I'll show you why on the next slide here. So this little bit of trivia. So what were the class rates, which was the rates that we were talking about just in the previous slide, back in 1996? Now, I know that some of you probably weren't born then. So, no, the young, but, so residential, just so you know, the class rate, which again was established by the legislature, so that it's 1%, and then the city adds on what the city needs to have to make its budget on top of that. But the starting point for residential back in 1996 was 1%. The apartments was 3.4%, and then the commercial was 4.6%. And if you add the extensions onto it, that kind of gets back to the 6%, the 4.5%, and the 1.5% on the previous slide. So what are the class rates as of today? Residential's 1%, apartments are 1.25%, and the commercial is between 1.5% and 2%. And the 1.5% is for 150,000, or values of up to 150,000. After 150,000, they go to 2%. And the interesting thing is that, so if you're a residential property owner, you have had no property tax relief at the legislature for the most part since 1996. If you were the apartment rate, you saw it by more than half drop, as well as the commercial, you saw that drop significantly as well. So why is that important? There's two factors. One is when we're calculating values or calculating taxes, we're looking at the overall rate that the legislature identifies, and then we deal with budgets, and we also deal with values. And property tax burden can be shifted depending on how the market is moving. As commercial values go up, they carry a larger percentage of the tax burden. As residential values go up, they carry a larger percentage of the tax burden. And if they go up in, harmoniously at the same time, then it's a fairly neutral impact. So we take a look at 1996, we had about $7.9 billion in residential value. If you look at commercial, we had $4.1 billion. So we almost had just about twice as much residential as we did in commercial. But by today's day, we have $23 billion in residential values. We've seen a significant growth. That's 197% growth in our tax base in residential properties alone versus the $7.5 billion in commercial, which has grown 83%. But as I go back to the tax base, and if one segment of the tax base is growing faster than another, they're going to now carry a larger share of the tax burden. And then with the previous slide, when we say, well, how are the rates? If the rates are then also changing, and if they're changing towards to favor one property type or another, it can have really an outstanding effect. And if you take a look at this, this is a 1996 pie chart versus 2014. In 1996, the residential tax base carried 33% of the tax burden, commercial had 56%, and the apartment values carried 11%. Today, it's just the reverse. The property tax owners, the residential property tax owners, are carrying 52% versus the commercial, which is carrying 35%. And again, this is pretty significant because, when property taxpayers are saying, why are my taxes always going up? It's because there's a number of things. One is the rate had changed, Plus, the amount of growth that we'd seen in this market has changed as well. And when the mayor and the council say we want to have property tax growth, that's extremely important just because you can definitely have an impact on who pays taxes or who's paying a larger share as growth does occur. So this slide, was there any questions on the last couple of slides? I only have about 7, and then I'll turn the mic back over.
That's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So how our property tax is calculated, my staff at this time of the year, from January till about March, are doing the analysis. We base it on sales in all the residential values. Then when we get into the income-producing properties like the apartments or commercial, we do the income approach as well as the sales comparison approach. And then we arrive at a market value that we distribute usually by the end of January or early part of February. At that point in time, all the property owners are noticed of their value, and then they have an appeals process which goes for about 30 days. And then we try to get out and take a look at every one of those property owners that have had an issue with their value. If we can't come to an agreement on value, then we go through before the local board. And the local board is actually occurring this week. Actually, it was last Friday was our first local board. We had probably 30 people attending that. And then this Friday we have, I think, 50 people slated to speak. And then at the close of that, that's about all the people that we have that really feel that they want to have an opportunity to speak before the local board of appeal and equalization.
And just to be clear, Mr. Todd, are any of those people saying they'd like to pay more in taxes?
Mr. Chair, no, not yet. During the downtime, when the market was going down, there were people that wanted to refi, and they would literally come in and ask for a higher value because the more value they had on their assessor's tax roll, some lenders were willing to lend right off the assessed value. And believe it or not, we have an obligation to check out their value as well. So if someone calls to say our value is wrong and it should be less, we look at it. And if someone says, hey, my value should be higher, we have an equal responsibility. But we would never change it unless, in fact, our data supported the higher value.
Okay.
But we do treat them like everybody else, believe it or not. So the local board of equalization is really going to be happening, and by next Friday we will be done. At that point in time, anyone that doesn't feel like they were heard or was not satisfied with the outcome could go to the county, and the county starts in June. And then once the county is done, those values are really locked down, and we send it to the Department of Revenue, who then uses those numbers to start making calculations for next year's changes for or property tax policies, I guess. So. I think that's about all I really want to talk about. This is, the taxing districts. One of the confusing things that oftentimes happens is when people call and they have an issue with their taxes, they can be sent to the department or to Hennepin County, and they'll say, because I have a problem with my taxes, and then Hennepin County sends them to us, and then we'll find out that, well, what you're talking about is not a value question, but an actual tax question. Then we send them back to Hennepin County. We're in a unique situation. A lot of the counties don't have what's called what's called the city of the first class. So we are statutorily able to arrive at our own values. Where Hennepin County, Anoka County, Dakota County, for the most part, they do their own assessing and then they do their own levying of those taxes. Minneapolis is a little bit different. So we are like an appraisal shop for the city of Minneapolis. We arrive at all the values. We determine if it's a residential, commercial, industrial property. We send Hennepin County then all the data. And then once we send them the data, they actually do the calculation of taxes. They levy the tax, they collect the tax, and then they send it to the budget director, and she'll spend it. Or divvy it out. The council will spend it. So there are times people have a difficult time understanding when is it a county issue and when is it the assessor's office. And we do a pretty good job making sure we try to get them to the right person the first time. So the role of assessor, I think I kind of already covered that. Our purpose is there just to fulfill a statutory requirement, which is to arrive at a market value for the purposes of property taxes, which is just 1/3 of the. There's only 3 types of taxes, as the budget director said: property taxes, income taxes, and sales tax. And our purposes is just there to help support the funding source of property taxes as a revenue for the city of Minneapolis. So. And then the valuation, again, we just come up with what's a market value as of January 2nd, and we look at real estate value. We look at what's called a fee simple real estate value versus what's called a leased fee real estate value, there's a significant difference. The leased fee would be what is the value of that building based on a lease. Good example is when the IDS building sells, the IDS building might sell for $280 million. Our assessed value might sit at $225, and people are like, how come you aren't having it right at $280 million? And the reason being is that investor will do some analysis, and if someone paid a premium because the quality of a tenant in the IDS building, or because of the fact that the IDS building is one of the premier pieces of real estate in the city of Minneapolis, and they pay a premium to have the IDS, you can't tax on that. You can only really tax on the sticks and bricks. So when we do our analysis, if they paid more than what we feel is fair market value based on the real estate, the excess or the surplus would also, what we would deem as the leased fee. What is the value of maybe that premier tenant or that marquee piece of real estate. So market value, when we look at it, can be sometimes different than what's being sold out there. And then taxable market value. Taxable market value it used to be more significant in years gone by when we had what's called a limited market value program. It's where we actually had to maintain two different values. One was market value, and the other was taxable market value. And the reason why we had a taxable market value is the legislature back in the early 90s and mid 2000s said they didn't want to see property tax, they didn't want to see taxpayers being taxed out of their home. So they said that the assessor's office couldn't raise their taxable market value any more than 12% in 1 year. And for a few years back in the late 90s, early 2000s, things were going up much faster. So then what was happening is we would have to have two values, one that was capped at the legislative cap, and the other one was what is the fair market value. And so then we had two numbers for the most part, taxable market value versus just regular market value.
Excuse me, Mr. Tan. Councilmember Glidden, you had a question? Please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I was trying to look at the presentation, so I hope I'm not making a point that you've made. But one of the interesting things that I didn't realize until we had a few particular situations in Minneapolis was that while the assessor does play a significant role in identifying the value, there is an oversight role of the state, and the assessor has to be, and if you can remind me, I thought it was between 95% and 105% of, anyway, maybe you can describe this, because you're really very constrained, and there is a repercussion to the property tax owner if we are wrong or later determined by the state to be wrong. And this came up as we were trying to deal with a really difficult market where property tax value was decreasing in many neighborhoods, and how to appropriately value those properties. So I don't know if you want to just talk about that for a minute.
Sure. Through the chair, Councilmember Glidden, the Department of Revenue does oversight over all assessing jurisdictions, the 88 counties in the state of Minnesota, and they do what's called a sales ratio analysis. And they take a look at, in very simplistic terms, what was it assessed at and what did it sell for? And they want you to be statistically between 90 and 105% as a median for a city. Now, the city of Minneapolis has around 7,000 sales. And they'll break it down between residential, commercial, industrial, and apartment. And then they run the ratios on those each individual cases. And before they even do that, we submit what we feel are valid sales. Foreclosures are generally not thrown in as a valid sale. There's usually extenuating circumstances. Estate sales may or may not be market. Payoff of contract for deeds, title transfers in a divorce situation. Those are all transfers, but some of those are not considered a market transaction. So we submit what we feel is all the valid sales in Minneapolis. Then the Department of Revenue does an independent assessment themselves, say this is what they feel are all the valid sales in Minneapolis. And then we compare notes and we go, okay, these 6,800 out of the 7,000, we all agree on. These last 200, we both disagree on. And then we compare notes. We verified this, we talked to the property owner, and this is why we feel it's valid or invalid. And they do the same thing. And then at some point, we arm wrestle over the last few, and then we both have an agreement on the set of data that we use for the sales ratio, and then they start running their ratios. And at that point, by statute, they do want us between 90 and 105%. And if it's outside those parameters, then the Department of Revenue can step in and say, we don't think you're doing a good job. We're going to bring in our own assessors and reassess the entire jurisdiction or pockets of the jurisdiction they feel might be out of equalization, and then they would assess or they would charge back to the city those costs to do that type of work. So it's quite important for us to stay between that 90 and 105%. And there can be a significant consequence. And kind of touching on what Councilmember Glidden had talked about back in 2008, when the foreclosures started to hit, they really hit Minneapolis first, and then they kind of moved out to the suburbs, only because I think it started, nothing against Minneapolis, but we had a lot more activity going on. And so we saw that, we verified the sales, and we actually dropped our market consistent with what the foreclosure market and the short sales were going on. That moved us outside that range of sales ratio, and the Department of Revenue stepped in, and they actually percentaged us back up 5% in certain areas because they felt that we were overly exaggerating or overly shooting. We were overshooting the market back in 2008, only to find out in 2009 that the market really was dropping that fast, and consequently, it was unfortunate for some neighborhoods that they actually got moved up in value for 1 year, and that's not an appealable issue.
I think you raised a great point, because it really is an oversight function. It's the state saying, is this jurisdiction, and in this case Minneapolis, how are you doing on your assessing value? Is it fair? Mm-hmm. And over time, this is reported in the results Minneapolis programs of the assessor's office. How would you characterize how we do in the last 10 years?
Mr. Chair, I think we did outstanding. You know, we have a very, very complex city, Minneapolis. We have from some of the poorest areas in the metropolitan area to some of the most expensive homes in Minneapolis. When we get into some of the suburbs, they don't have difficult, challenging areas. You know, Richfield is just a lot of the same type of homes. You can get into Bloomington, a lot of the same types of homes. You know, very easy to model because they have a lot of sales of very similar types. In Minneapolis, we have a lot of very unique pieces of property. We can have values changed literally by block by block. And so because of that, I think we do an outstanding job because of the variety that we have to deal with. The other reason why the Department of Revenue really stresses uniformity for assessors or for assessing jurisdictions is because if we're at 90%, or let's say Minneapolis is at 85, but Hennepin County as a whole is at 95, or some of the other ANOCAs at a different number, that the property tax burden is just unfairly being advantageous. It'd be unfairly advantageous. We were always hanging around 85% of market value, and other jurisdictions were at 90, 95. So just to make sure that there's a lot of equity amongst the counties, they really do manage that fairly closely. So,
yeah, good. Thank you.
I think we kind of, you know, I talked a little bit about this in orientation, but what do? We do the values. We make sure values are correctly. We make sure classifications are important because that, as we saw, the legislature has different rates for different property types. And if you have the wrong rate, someone's going to be paying more taxes. It gets maybe more difficult when we get into mixed use. You got apartment up above, you got retail on the bottom, you know. What we don't do, and we also do the tax classification. When is a nonprofit meeting the statutory requirements to not have to pay taxes? What we don't do is taxes. Hennepin County calculates the taxes. I already talked about that. They print and mail the notices. They collect the taxes, and then they special assessments, like Reg Services and Public Works, also does special assessments for boardings, condemnations, things like that. A lot of people, when they call us, because those special assessment fees will be on their tax statement. So the first most logical call is to let me call the assessor and see if I can get these expenses waived, and we're oftentimes sending them to the person that has the most responsibility for putting those special assessments on. You know, this is a real quick assessment or a kind of recap of what our assessment cycle is this current cycle. You know, in February 2014, those notices were mailed. People are calling. We did another 30,000, which was our commercial industrial apartment in the February, and those people were calling. The last mailing is just everybody else. That's when we get some phone calls. Right now, we finished the 30 days of review. Tax statements are in the mail for everybody. You know, that's when the phones are ringing, and the local boards of appeal, for the most part, are going to be going on. And then in November, and this is when a lot of people will be calling, they're going to be calling when they get the truth and taxation notice saying, I'm looking at my next year's taxes or the proposal, and I'd like to contest my value because my value really doesn't look right. Boy, you know, by the end of the local boards, those numbers are locked down, and they get surprised at that point in time that they can't appeal their value in November of the year. And by that time, we've sent them a notice. They've seen it on their tax statement. There's been plenty of time to appeal it. And so it usually falls on, we try to explain the process, but there's just nothing we can do, so we don't usually, it usually falls on deaf ears, I would say.
And during the truth and taxation period, that accounts for whatever we're going to do with the levy?
That is correct, Mr. Chair. And this is just a trend in where the real estate values have been going, and we haven't come up with the median value from in residential, but it's about 10%. So I would, I do know that on our median increases in Minneapolis was about 10. So you could probably take 10% of 213 and you're going to be pretty close. And we'll have that number here at the end of the local boards. We really do lock down those numbers, so then we can start running those reports so we can get a concrete number on where the market went. And that's it.
Okay, so we've covered how the valuations are determined for the properties within the city, which is really just one component of determining what each individual property will be paying for property taxes. So what I want to talk to you about right now is how is that the overall number derived? Property taxes are not a function of the values of the properties. Rather, each local jurisdiction adopts a number, a dollar amount that they need in order to fund their budget. So the calculation that you see on this slide is the local government will determine what they need in order to accomplish their mission and their business for the year. They'll consider all of the other non-property tax revenue sources. And if you remember the previous time we were together, we have many different resources available to help fund the city. So we subtract the external revenues, and that leaves us with the remainder, which is the property tax need, the amount that is calculated at the end to fund all of the city's business. Sometimes that number is not a number that we're pleased with, which puts us back at the drawing board to relook at the overall expenditures for the city, and it's kind of an iterative process. If we have expenditures that are too high, we need to look at the revenues and adjust accordingly.
Real quickly, Ms. Christensen, before we get to, you're really telling the difference between what is known as the mill rate versus a levy. Many people are saying, how come my property taxes went up when my property values went down? Shouldn't it be a fixed percentage of that value?
Correct, and there'll be a couple of slides further along that will demonstrate that.
Thank you.
The annual property tax levy must be certified or adopted by, a proposed levy amount must be adopted by September 15th of each year. And in many cases, we just call that the maximum levy. Once we've determined the dollar amount that we're willing to tax for property taxes in the subsequent year, we certify it to the county. After that, we can adopt a lower amount in December. We cannot go higher. So we pretty much need to know by September 15th what we're going to need in order to fund the budget in the upcoming year. And that is the amount that is included on your truth and taxation statement. The truth and taxation statement, as Mr. Todd alluded to earlier, is mailed out by Hennepin County, and it gives the property owner kind of a heads up as to what their property taxes may look like in the next year. And then the levy is adopted in December, and again, it can't be higher than the number that we had in September. So how are property taxes calculated? As I just mentioned, the city adopts a dollar amount. We don't adopt a rate or a percent. We pick a number that we need to fund our budget. And in this example, I've picked a sample of 5 houses in one neighborhood. And in this city, their total levy, they need $10,000. Not likely, but $10,000 is the amount that they adopted. So what we do is we take the information that the assessor's office has compiled with all of the values of the property in that neighborhood. And as you can see, each property has a little bit different value, but in total it equates to $1,075,000. So how do we determine which property pays how much? We calculate a tax rate as a result of the values and the levy. Remember, the tax rate is not determined ahead of time. It's really the last calculation that comes after the valuations and the levy amount is adopted. So our tax rate in this neighborhood is slightly less than 1%. It's 0.0093. It's the total levy divided by the values in that neighborhood. and them, in order to assess the appropriate amount back to each property, that calculated rate is applied back to the individual property's value. So you can see that proportionally, each of these properties has their own value, and when you apply that rate, you come up with the amount of property taxes that they owe in that year. In a more simplistic way to calculate, you'll see I included the percentage or the proportion of each property as a piece of the total. So property A is 9% of the total valuation in that community, and you'll see that 9% of the $10,000 levy is $930. So there's kind of two ways you can come at it. Mr. Todd indicated that our values are likely to go up about 10%. So what happens when the values go up 10%? Is everybody's taxes going to go up 10%? No, they're not, because the overall levy has stayed the same. The city has determined that it is going to maintain a flat levy at $10,000, but now the valuations have gone up 10%, so we've got almost $1.2 million worth of value. What do we do next? We calculate the rate. So we have a $10,000 levy divided by a higher overall package of values in the city, which gives us a new rate of 0.0085. We now apply that new rate to the new values, and because the overall levy has not increased and each property is still proportionally at the same size wedge in that pie, they are paying the exact same dollar amount as they did in the previous year. Now, we know it's not likely that every single property is going to have their valuation change in an identical proportion or percentage amount, but it shows you that really it's the total levy and the valuation, and the rate is the last piece that's calculated. So what happens when we add more property into the mix? In this neighborhood, in the first year, we take from the previous slide that there's the 5 properties. And in the second year, somebody came in and built property F for $210,000. So we now have total valuation of, which I didn't write down, so it'd be about $2 million worth of valuation. And the levy has been maintained at $10,000. So with having more property value to spread the levy over, you'll see that all of the original 5 properties in that community saw their property taxes decrease just because they had the addition of an additional property. Is there any questions on?
This is really just Sandyville, right?
Yes, yes, very small community. Desiccated community, right. Very efficient too. I'm just going to move on to an overview of Minneapolis property taxes. As you're probably aware, there's several components to the city's overall property tax levy. Most of the time when we're talking about property taxes, we're contemplating what the city's operations and generally city budget. But we also have to take in consideration the park board, because they are included in the city's overall levy, the municipal building commission, and then also a levy for the teachers' retirement system. So when I mentioned that we need to take into consideration these other jurisdictions, when we come forward with a proposed levy amount in September, again, that's the maximum levy, we don't always know at that time how much property taxes are going to be requested by the building commission, by the park board. We know what the amount that we need to pay for some outstanding debt on the library, public housing, and the Teachers Retirement Association. So when we go into the budget process, we do have to maintain a little bit of flexibility, because when we've adopted a 1% reduction in the overall property taxes and individual components of the city's tax levy are higher than that, it necessitates that one of the participants has to adopt a lower than 1% reduction, or more than. This chart reflects the property tax history in the city of Minneapolis. You'll see that during the tough times with cuts in local government aid and other economic issues, really in about 2003 is when we first started seeing large reductions from the state in local government aid. And that kind of flowed through up until the last couple of years when that is stabilized. And you'll see that in 2012, the levy was maintained at a flat, no increase, slight increase in 13, and we were able to actually come forward with a 1% reduction in 2014. So you see that we've really been able to stabilize that property tax levy. This slide has a few terms that you may use for reference. I won't go through them, and additional information is available from many different resources. The Department of Revenue has some very useful fact sheets, as well as the House Research provides many, many different informational items that you can use in your constituents as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can wait until the presentation is done.
I think you're ready to go now.
Oh, I'm ready to go. Okay, well, great. I have 4 questions, and either you or Mr. Todd can answer the questions. The first one, I just noticed that, we're levying for the library, and it was my understanding that I guess we consolidated at some point for the county, so why are we still doing that?
The $9 million levy is associated with outstanding debt issue. So we had issued some bonds before the county took over the library, so we are still liable to pay for those. So when we have paid off those bonds, you'll no longer see a levy for that.
Okay. Second question is with regards to the pilot or payment in lieu of taxes. Assuming that the businesses there don't agree to pay that, does that mean that we can withhold services from them?
I don't believe that's the case.
Okay. And
I wondered if we could give a couple of examples. I mean, the biggest one obviously down is the University of Minnesota. What are some of the other organizations that we would be doing payment in lieu of taxes?
The Public Housing Authority provides a 5% of their annual net rent to the city as a pilot payment. I'm not.
Is this a negotiated?
Yeah, there's some nursing home. Yeah, yes, it is a negotiated item. Typically, the starting point of the negotiation is what would they have been paying in property taxes? Were they subject to taxation on that parcel?
Yeah, I had a very similar question. So go ahead.
okay. My third question is, in terms of property taxes, we tend to hear people complain about how high their property taxes are, and I'm wondering, relative to other states such as Wisconsin, even, how do we compare to them?
My answer is mostly anecdotal, but my understanding is, having done some research, that because the state of Minnesota has its rather complicated mechanisms of the class rates and using net tax capacity rather than a flat mill rate, that our property taxes, residential, are likely lower than others.
Okay. And my last question is with regards to, I, along with other council members here, sit on the Transportation and Public Works Committee, and one of the consistent themes that comes through whenever we're talking about special assessments related to resurfacing or reconstruction of streets is, well, don't I already pay for that within the context of property taxes? Why do you need to do a special assessment on me or other neighbors like myself? And I guess I don't know if this is the appropriate question for you both today, but I'm just wondering, with regards to that, why isn't that built in so that the resident complaint about it should just be built into the process, not a part of that?
The determination to issue special assessments is really a policy issue. We're not mandated to do that, but and I would have to do a little research, but the amount of property tax increase overall that would be necessary to fund reconstructions, there would be a significant increase in property taxes, which again, it's a policy decision.
Thank you.
Good. Councilmember Palmisano, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions and some that I've been speaking with Mr. Todd about through particular constituents, but I just kind of want to get out in the open and into this committee. And The 13th Ward is an area where there's a lot of rapid change in single-family housing, and that is met with some consternation. For example, yesterday, my father brought home from a walk a real estate market new home that is selling for $1 million, and the property taxes listed for it are $3,900. Obviously, that's not the eventual case of this home, but could you help us to just understand how long does it take for the home's market value to adjust? Is it truly just January 2nd of that next year?
Through the chair, Councilmember Palmisano. Yes, to answer your question, January 2nd is the statutory date that we have to look at every parcel and estimate a market value for that if what was on that site at that point in time. So in some situations where there's new construction, if a developer buys a lot, let's say in November of the year, and he knocks it down or she knocks it down in December, and on January 1 it's a vacant lot, by February, they start doing the foundation, and by June, that particular property is already fully established, sold for $1 million. Their tax bill on the next January, or the next cycle will still be sitting as a vacant lot because on January 2nd, it was a vacant lot, even though for 50% of the year, it was $1 million parcel sitting or improvement on that particular lot. We then, at that point, when we go out and take a look at that new construction the following year, we do put that $1 million parcel on for whatever the market value is at that time. And then the following assessment is when that first tax bill is arrives in the mailbox, assessing that particular property owner for $1 million. Now, there's a percentage of property developers that do that. There's a percentage of nonprofits that do it. When they know that there's a certain filing deadline, if they're going to buy real estate and take it off the tax rolls, they're going to try to make sure their business model meets those deadlines. They'd miss it by a day, pay one more full year of taxes if they didn't have to. So, but that same calendar works for if you're putting in a kitchen remodel. We're going to catch that kitchen remodel the first year after it's complete. It goes on the assessment rolls, and then you'll pay for that new kitchen remodel the following year. So the calendar is the same for everyone. It just is a more obvious, or looks inconsistent when you see $1 million property and the real estate agent is saying, oh, the taxes are $3,000. Well, that's a lot tax, and we will absolutely, and we pick up partials that, when somebody starts something earlier in the year, if it's 50% done, we add 50% of that value. We don't wait until the project's complete to add all value. It's what was there at that particular time on January 2nd. So, but it's a very good question, and it has been raised by some people.
So then, just as a follow-on to that, it does adjust automatically. So assuming that home is fully built and is sold for the amount of money that, for $1 million, just for ease sake, that is totally taxable then in that arrears kind of way. It's not like my understanding is home improvement projects step up over a couple years' time. Is that not the case?
No, we don't.
It's a full adjustment.
We only will add partials when partial construction is finished, but we don't add partial values just to ease in the taxes. If it's an abrupt, it's going from $3,000 to $18,000, it's the obligation of the debt obligation or the tax obligation for the property owner is that. There have been times, it doesn't happen very often, but every few years we do find where there's a property record that's missing. There could oftentimes, it's these rear of the lotters where there was a house in front and there was a house right off the alley. Somehow it fell off the records through a data conversion or something like that. We find it years later and we add $100,000 like that, and the property owner wasn't anticipating it, but that's just, the statute doesn't allow us to prorate or to ease it in, or there's not property tax programs that, there are property tax programs for senior citizens that might need some assistance, but generally speaking, if we were to be the determining factor, who needed to be eased in and who didn't, that'd be a horrible place. So we just say the law says we have to have it at market value on January 2nd of every year. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good. Vice President Glidden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Councilmember Yang's questions just made me think of a couple things that I just wanted to point out. And it was a good question, too, about what all do we pay for and not pay for within our property taxes, because we certainly could make different policy choices about that. But it's also reminding me that, within city to city in the state of Minnesota, there are a lot of different choices that are made and about what to encompass within property taxes versus other methods of payment. And the biggest one I'm thinking of right now is the city of St. Paul. And so there is a difference probably in where we're at in terms of our property tax compared to the city of St. Paul, but they have a pretty different way of paying for all of their kind of like the really traditional city stuff than we do. And it's been a debate in Minneapolis in past years. And so I just wanted to point that out in case we want to have that debate here again at some point. So the city of St. Paul, there's a mechanism at the state which authorizes for street type of issues, and I'm going to say it wrong, but essentially all their street sweeping and street repair and all these kinds of things, there's a separate place on their bill where they will see, and it's not under property taxes, but it's a separate fee that they pay, and it's for services that are essentially your traditional public works services. In the city of Minneapolis, since I've been a council member, we actually have had this debate about whether we should turn to a system that's a little bit more like St. Paul or not. And traditionally, we have had the outlook that we should encompass more things within the property tax, because then it's more transparent in the sense that you have one place you're looking to what's the property taxpayer paying, rather than having to add together all sorts of different fees that you see on your bill and then trying to say what does that add up to. But it is a policy decision as to whether we should have separate fees for certain kinds of services and whether we're authorized to do that, or whether we should have property taxes as kind of a big lump sum to pay for many of our general fund services, and then make our decisions from that pot of money. So I don't know if Mr. Todd or Ms. Christensen wants to better describe than I have what's the difference between our system and St. Paul's. It does mean that what you kind of see on the property tax bill might look different, but then you have to add in what are all these other fees they might be paying. So.
Yes, Chair Quincy, Councilmember Glidden, I believe that the mechanism is it's a street maintenance district assessment, whereby the businesses particularly are assessed a certain amount, I think based upon their their footage along the street, and then they see that cost come on their annual property tax statement. It can be a little confusing too, because special assessments in general just show up as one line item, and it doesn't necessarily specify what it's for. So you as a property owner may see special assessment, and in order to determine what that is for, you may need to call the county or the city in which you live.
Yeah, in my example, I would have my sidewalk and my street resurfacing all combined. It shows up as special assessment.
Correct.
But I don't know how much of that was my sidewalk versus that, or an alley reconstruction. But I think, to Vice President Glidden's point, St. Paul, I know, would charge for street lighting and street maintenance, and a different way of breaking it out.
Many cities did implement a number of the utilities. Streetlight utility was one item that many cities implemented during the round of LGA on allotments in about 2008. So they can either handle it as a utilities, the way the city of Minneapolis handles water, storm sewer, and its solid waste, or as an assessment.
Good. Thank you very much. Do you have any further questions or comments?
Just the last thing I'm going to say is we are in such a different environment today, and the experience I have in my ward may be different than what people are experiencing in other parts of the city. But just as someone who spent a lot of time knocking on doors last year, I have to say that bringing up property taxes happened infrequently in my experience. And I just maybe in part that's a comparison to prior years where virtually every person I talked to brought up property taxes. And so in some ways I think it doesn't seem as maybe it's not the issue that we hear about, but it will be. and it is. It's just this is such an important fundamental part of our education process about property taxes and how we fund local government and what's the right amount of funds to use through the property tax system. I just wanted to say to folks that we may not have heard quite to the extreme we have in past years, but sometimes you never know what will happen with the economy or other things that drive that conversation, where once again residents will really feel that pressure of property taxes, and we will as well. So thank you.
Exactly correct. Every year we have a value proposition that we put forward. Are you getting value for what you're experiencing? Are we delivering the services? And that's the oversight function that we get to do. So should be an exciting year. Mr. Carpenter, the closing comments. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember.
Do we have another topic that would cover TIF? Or otherwise, I have a quick question, which is, do we have TIF districts that are active right now? And about how much that is out of our tax base?
We do have active TIF districts. I do not have the number on the tip of my tongue, but I'd be happy to forward that information to members of the committee.
Yeah, I think we covered that a little bit in one of our earlier conversations about our debt conversations, but we could certainly provide more information, because what TIF does it keep money out of the property tax general collection?
Right. And it's also important to comment that it doesn't raise taxes for the other properties. It slows down the property tax relief that comes from the additional growth. So it doesn't cause taxes to go up. It just shifts them to a different bucket.
Very good. Thank you. We look forward to more detail on that. Would be very helpful. Thank you. Now the final word.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I was just going to point out and remind folks that in Sandyville here, we're only talking about the city portion. And any property owner experiences the city portion as somewhere between 30 and 40% usually of the entire bill. So just a reminder that no matter what policy decisions we make, individual impacts will be dramatically affected by what the county and the school districts in particular decide to do, which may or may not be aligned with us from a policy perspective. So,
yeah, thank you for that clarification. So just to recap, that was 30 to what percent is a city of a individual's typical property tax bill? What percentage is the city?
Mr. Chair, generally I think it's around 40%, but it varies substantially by a whole number of factors, but less than half usually. Good.
Well, thank you very much, folks, for this presentation. I think I just want to highlight the May 19th meeting. We'll be doing a deeper dive into our city expenditures, so that would be an exciting presentation. We hope it has illustrations and perhaps some video that would be really fun if you could do that. And always welcome to hear from committee members other topics that we would like to be covering, just as a background for us all before we get into the big budget season. So with that, I think I'd like to receive and file this and move that same action. Sorry, I thought you were looking for me. All those in favor of receive and file, please say aye. Aye. And I believe that concludes our agenda for this morning. So this afternoon, and we are adjourned.